Please note that this podcast episode features themes and depictions of self-harm and suicidal ideation. This episode may be triggering for some listeners and features a content warning. If you or someone you care about needs support, please visit www.blackdog.org.au or www.beyondblue.org. If you reside in Australia, you can call the Lifeline helpline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 224 636. For listeners outside of Australia, please visit www.findahelpline.com. G'day everybody, my name is Elliot Waters and you're listening to the Dysregulated podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Today's episode is the third installment of the Discharge Papers series, where we go back and have a look at what my doctors and psychiatrists were thinking and perceiving of me during some of my most acute and distressing mental health episodes. But before we get into that, I just want to say, if you're enjoying the show, feel free to like, subscribe, give us a rating and share it around with your mates. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, you can certainly do so at elliot.t.waters. For today's episode, we're going back to the 22nd of February 2019, back when I was a young, fit, but extremely mentally unwell 28-year-old. But in order to appropriately evaluate the discharge papers here on today's episode, we need to initially go back a little bit further and talk about the context in which this all went down. So on the 20th of February 2019, I was admitted on that fateful day to the psychiatric ward here at the Mater Hospital in Newcastle. Now, my memories of this particular day are quite vivid. It almost feels like it happened yesterday, but thank goodness it didn't. It was 3 years ago. That's the good news. But the first thing I remember was when I woke up, straight away, I was just barreled by a wave of negative emotion. There was this constant, obsessive rumination that was just ringing in my ears, and I could not do anything to turn those ruminating thoughts down. It was so overpowering and overbearing. Now, at this point, it needs to be said, I only had 2 diagnoses. We've got like 7 or 8 now, but back then I only had 2, which was generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. But looking back now, those 2 diagnoses certainly didn't encapsulate the strength and severity of these intense obsessive ruminations. So with the benefit of hindsight, now that I've got a few more diagnoses and I know a little bit more about myself, I look back now and quite clearly I can see 3 diagnoses in particular that were at play. The first one being major depressive disorder, because the whole deal with rumination is that you're thinking about things that may have not gone the way you wanted them to in the past. And depression as a disorder certainly is all about living in the past, whereas anxiety, on the other hand, is more about living in the future, catastrophizing about things that may happen. But depression is really ruminating and feeling those negative emotions about things that have happened in the past that you just can't let go of. So major depressive disorder was certainly a key proponent of this obsessive rumination. The second disorder that was playing a key role, which I wasn't diagnosed with yet, although that was to come very soon, is borderline personality disorder, because my ruminations, the subject material, was all about my girlfriend at the time. And just to add another layer of context to what was going on at this point, me and this girlfriend at the time, we were just about to break up and the writing was on the wall, and needless to say, I was not handling it very well whatsoever. So major depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, and the third one was obsessive compulsive disorder. So I've got OCD but without compulsions, but I definitely have that obsessive component to my psyche. And that was a big part of this story as well at this point, because these ruminations were the same thing over and over and over again. Obsessed with this idea around this relationship. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this relationship, but let me tell you, those episodes are coming because this particular relationship really ties everything together nicely. So I promise I will tell you all about the things that went on with this particular breakup and how it has changed my life moving forward. But that is for episodes that are yet to come. I'm not going to spoil it just yet. So looking back, that rumination, that obsessive rumination, very much a consequence of major depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. But as I said at this point, I only had 2 diagnoses, which was generalized anxiety disorder and depression. And even at this time, I knew there was more going on, that those 2 disorders didn't encapsulate all the behaviors, all the thoughts and emotions that I was feeling. But thankfully, from the 22nd onwards, we had a bit of clarity around what was going on. Anyway, let's continue. So this particular day, I had to go to work. I was rostered to work. And at this point, I was working at Bunnings Warehouse. So all the Aussies will know Bunnings very, very well. For the uninitiated, for the international listeners, Bunnings Warehouse is a retail store that sells hardware, building materials and lifestyle products. And at that point, that is where I was working. Now, the problem is, of course, that these negative cognitions, the last thing they wanted me to do, the last thing these mental illnesses wanted me to do was go to work. And that was a general rule, not just this day, but every day. And the reason for that is pretty clear, because these mental illnesses don't want you to succeed in life. They want you to fail and fail miserably. And for good or for worse, working and being employed and doing all that sort of stuff is a very big component when it comes to leading a successful, happy life. It's a real building block of building a life worth living, you could say. This particular day, the last thing I wanted to do was go to work, but go to work I did. Now, I just want to interject quickly because I want to sort of highlight that point just a little bit here. How important it is for people with mental illness to still do everything they can to stay engaged with the workforce. And there's 2 key reasons, as far as I understand it, as to why working is such an important component of fighting back against these mental illnesses. And I touched on the first reason just before, because these mental illnesses don't want us to succeed. They do not want us doing things which better our lives. They want to drag us down constantly. And if we are able to push back and go, listen, how about you be quiet? I'm going to work. I'm doing what I need to do to build a life worth living. Leave me alone. If we are able to push back and still get to work and get the job done and do a good job and really focus on what we're doing, then that strengthens those neural connections which we use to push back against mental illness. It empowers the individual because you know that you can do it. But if we give in, and there's no judgments here if people give in, by the way, to mental illness. I've done it many times and it's taken a long time to get to this point where I'm a lot more robust in the face of this negative emotion. But unfortunately, taking the option of not going to work reinforces those poor maladaptive coping strategies. And that's why it's so important to fight back and say, no, although I don't want to go to work, I'm going to go there, give it me all and achieve something today. Pipe down mental illnesses. And the second reason is because work, as far as I see it anyway, is the great distractor. So some of my really terrible moods before going to work, I thought there is no way I can do this because there's just too much negativity going on. But once I got stuck in, focused on the tasks at hand, really externalized from my brain. So instead of just living inside my brain, constantly ruminating, thinking negative thoughts or catastrophizing about the future, which is something I do so often, by being at work, you're sort of forced to focus outside the self. So working is the great distractor. And if you're going through some really tough times, for at least 8 hours, you can focus on something else. Now, of course, if somebody's going through a really acute mental health episode, like myself in this story, as I'm about to tell, that can be very difficult. But work and being engaged is a good way to push back against mental illness. Anyway, I press on. So I woke up and there's this constant rumination, but I went to work. Now, like I said, ordinarily work is the great distractor, but even this particular day, I just could not get the focus off all the negativity in my mind and focus on the tasks at hand. So I remember on this day, I'd go to the toilet. At times there was crying. I'd be hiding around the back of the building. I'd be crying on the phone to a friend saying, mate, today is not a good day. We're in big, big trouble. And it really felt, I remember being scared, like my cognitions, my emotions, it scared the living hell out of me because it felt like I was in my own version of hell, that is for sure. It felt like the walls were closing in and the complexity of life was suffocating. And the real problem was that I didn't have this belief that I had the tools or the strength to fight off and get out of this complexity that I was creating for myself. And unfortunately, when a lot of people have attempted suicide and report what their headspace was like during the time, a very common theme is that life is just so complex and I cannot see a way out of the complexity. And for me, that morning, that day, that was a huge part of my thought process. That is for sure. So I remember ringing my friend and, saying that things are really hit the limit here. We're in big, big trouble. And he just said to me, like I just said before, just concentrate on your work, try and distract yourself for now, try and achieve something, and then you'll feel better about yourself. But unfortunately, this particular day, there was no getting out of this very, very dark mood. So anyway, so the shift ends, and then I remember I walked to my car. Now, as I said, although I couldn't get out of this negative headspace, there were opportunities where I was distracted. I was forced to be distracted from my own inner turmoil. But once I finished work that day, the distraction was gone and it was just me and my thoughts. And it was nighttime when I finished. The moon was out, and I always have my deepest thoughts at night and my darkest thoughts as well quite often. And this day was no different, but it was dialed up to 11. I remember walking to my car. It was dark. It was cold. The moon was shining, and I felt trapped by my own thoughts, and those walls were getting closer and closer and were about to squish me at any moment. And it's interesting there that I say it was cold because it was February at this time, which is summer in Australia, and obviously Australia is a bloody hot place. But I felt cold and everything was grey. I remember looking around and everything was just grey. Obviously being at night sort of helped that along, that's for sure, but everything was grey and cold. It was very surreal. But it was about to get more surreal because I jumped into my car with every intentions of driving home, and I just could not move, and I had a breakdown and I started crying, and then a bit of a psychotic break occurred. So this wasn't a full-blown case of psychosis because I knew once I started having these sort of delusions and entered this dream state, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, I knew that it wasn't actually my reality. So it wasn't a full psychotic episode. But at the same time, I allowed myself to be in this dream state and live it out, and it felt like it was my reality. But there was that little voice saying, no, this isn't our reality, unfortunately. This is only a dream. This is only a bit of a delusion. But that's what can happen under extreme emotional stress because the brain wants to escape. The brain doesn't want to be under that sort of turmoil. So sometimes it creates its own reality to try and escape the pain that we're feeling. So in this case, this dream state took me to my happy place, which was to my wedding day. Yes, my wedding day is my happy place, and I was getting married to my girlfriend at the time. And needless to say, that dream state that I was in has not turned out to be the reality of the situation. But that's okay, that's fine. But it is interesting as well. We should sort of analyse this, psychoanalyse it a little bit, why my wedding day would be my happy place. And I'll tell you why, because at this point, my measure that I use, my metric on if I'm a decent person or not was if I was in a loving relationship. This is borderline personality 101, definitely. My metric was not, doing community work or being a good friend or a good son or a good brother, etc. It was whether I was in a relationship and it was successful. And obviously getting married is very symbolic and, is sort of symbolic of the fact that we have won the game. And Elliot, because you're married, that means you're a good person. The good news is that is definitely not my metric that I measure my success upon now. That is for sure. Don't get me wrong, I'd still like to get married and all that sort of stuff. And I am still hopelessly single. But at the same time, I know that there's other important things which also deserve to have significance placed on them. Anyway, So yes, I was in this dream state, my happy place, which was my wedding day. And I remember I was on the phone to my sister at this point, and I was sort of babbling incoherently, and then my phone died. But thankfully, my sister realised that I would have been at work, and she come around and picked me up, and then they took me off to the Mater Hospital, and I was admitted onto the ward. One or two sort of comical parts, well, sort of comical. I think it's comical. I guess it's my story, so let's say comical. Two comical components of this story. The first one, so as I said, I was sort of hiding around behind the building. I was going to the toilets all the time, crying, calling my friends, saying the walls are closing in. This is the end. Lots of suicidal ideation was going on, unfortunately, that's for sure. I remember at one point on my shift, one of the majors came down, and this was so ironic, unbelievably so. She said, "Elliot, I love the positive energy that you bring to this place. Please never change. I love your positivity." And I remember I started laughing, which I guess sort of reaffirmed that whole positivity thing. But I was having arguably the worst day that I've ever had, and yet one of the managers come down and said they loved my positivity, even though I was in such emotional turmoil. Unbelievable. So that goes to show how strong my facade is, the persona that I can put on to hide my real thoughts and feelings. And for so long, that facade was so strong that I hid my own thoughts and feelings from myself. But that facade, that mask, that persona has definitely dropped away now, that's for sure. And the second comical point is that when I got to my car, so as I said, I had this sort of psychotic break thing because the emotional drama and flooding feeling was so strong that I just had to escape somehow. But one of the ways that I tried to escape was, I must admit, through the use of self-harm. So we have these box cutters at work that don't cut anything because they're safety knives and they're so safe they don't actually do anything. And let me tell you, these safety knives aren't very good at cutting skin either. So I was trying to cut myself and my wrist to try and ground myself, and instead of feeling emotional pain, I wanted to transfer that towards physical pain. But unbelievably, these knives, they barely cut boxes, so there was no chance they were going to cut my skin, and it didn't work. And I remember at one point laughing, thinking how ridiculous this situation was, but unfortunately that laughter did not last for very long. So as I said, my sister eventually figured out where I was. When she arrived, I was slumped over in my seat. I had tears streaming down my face, and I was sort of in that other world that I was teleporting to. And then when she opened the door, I was laying on the door and I fell out of the car. Then I was snapped back to reality. And then she said, "I think we need to take you up to the hospital." And that's exactly what she and my family did. So there you go. There's more to tell of that story, and I will do that in future episodes, but that's probably enough for now. So let's move on. So anyway, I went to the psychiatric ward. I was there overnight, and it was really about trying to contain any sort of self-harm behavior, any suicidality, suicidal ideation that I may have and definitely was having at that time. And like I said, at this point, I only had 2 diagnoses, and the doctors up at the hospital had a feeling there might be a bit more at play. So they referred me onto the James Fletcher campus, which is another specific mental health hospital here in Newcastle. And I had an appointment with the psychiatrist there, and I was with him for 2 hours, and we went through everything. And at the end of that, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. But that was all. The other diagnoses were to come later, and we will look at those discharge sheets further down the track. But anyway, so terrible day. I was ringing my friend constantly. The walls were closing in. This was the end. I was having lots of suicidal ideation. I even resorted to some self-harm tendencies as well. And it must be said, I've never been a self-harm sort of person, or at least not in that way. I will self-harm by being a workaholic and just driving myself into the ground by working too hard and other things like that. But I've never been so big on the whole self-harm thing, but I was in such a heightened state that I was desperate to escape the pain that I was feeling, and that's what I tried to resort to. But the tools that I had didn't do the job. I even tried so hard, and it says it here in the discharge notes, which we'll go through now. They even tried to use my car keys to try and hack it myself, and that didn't really work either. So, went to the psychiatric ward, was there for 2 days, got looked at, decided that I needed to be referred onto a psychiatrist for a really in-depth account of what was going on and to try and come up with some strategies moving forward. Now, this was definitely a turning point. This appointment with the psychiatrist really got the ball rolling. But at the same time, not all of my diagnoses that I have now were diagnosed on this particular occasion. A lot of them would come later still. So at the end of this particular appointment, I was given the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, but other diagnoses I've collected over the years, such as ADHD, bipolar disorder, caffeine use disorder, social anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's so many of them. Anyway, they were to come later, but I did get my borderline personality disorder diagnosis here. And it must be said that at this time, of all the diagnoses that I had then and that I have now, and then applying them retrospectively, at this point of my journey, borderline personality disorder was the chief proponent, that is for sure. Anyway, let's now get into the discharge papers. So it starts like this. James Fletcher, Mater Mental Health Service, Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia. Okay, triage nurse notes to begin with. Family requesting to see mental health practitioners. Increased depression, fluctuating suicidality, making eye contact, calm presence, history of depression, anxiety. Okay, that sounds about right. Patient referred by Calvary Mater Newcastle Emergency Department, presents voluntarily with worsening depression and sleep, reports fluctuating suicidal thoughts. Okay, this is from the psychiatrist. To my doctor. Thank you for your ongoing care of Elliot Waters, a young man in his 3rd year of a Bachelor of Psychology course. He presented voluntarily, brought in by his parents after a self-harm episode using his car keys. That is true. Discharged from psychiatric ward on the 21st of February, with plan to engage with psychologist, looking to increase venlafaxine or Effexor, that is a serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor antidepressant. Anyway, moving on. Looking to increase venlafaxine dosage from 75 milligrams to 150 milligrams, and then titrating upwards to 225 milligrams, which incidentally enough is the max dosage for venlafaxine. Has added recently low dose quetiapine, 12.5 milligrams in the morning, 25 milligrams at night. Context. Elliot went to work, finished, then feeling distressed in his car, upset, crying, went to harm himself using a box cutter. However, the blade was not sharp enough to do any damage. He then used keys to self-harm, making superficial cuts on his right wrist. He has shown increasing distress over the last few weeks associated with ruminations regarding his girlfriend who is in Argentina. Oh dear. Met her on a 6-month exchange in the United Kingdom, and he recently returned from the UK. And I will say this, there are going to be plenty of episodes about this particular relationship because they have had such a bearing on my mental health journey to begin with, in a negative sense, but definitely in a positive sense moving forward. And there's a lot of great lessons that have been learnt from that particular relationship. But anyway, that is down the track. Let's keep going. Elliot has a history of interpersonal sensitivity and emotional dysregulation, hence the name of the podcast, since adolescence. He often becomes preoccupied with his girlfriend's past relationship experiences. Oh man, that sentence right there is borderline personality disorder 101. That is so fundamental to the disorder. Unbelievable, as is the interpersonal sensitivity, I might add, and the emotional dysregulation. General practitioner diagnosed depression and anxiety. Commenced on venlafaxine, previously on dosages up to 225 milligrams. However, not taking for some time, then recently recommenced on 75 milligrams. Increased to 150 milligrams whilst in the Mater psychiatric ward a few days prior. Elliot lives at home with supportive parents and a younger sister since returning from the United Kingdom. no trauma history, which isn't actually true. But at this point, I didn't realise that there was some emotional trauma going on. Remember, this is at the start of the turning point. So I didn't know what was going on at this point, and the doctors were struggling to sort of figure out as well, because it's hard. Obviously, I need to tell them what I'm feeling, but if I don't really know what I'm feeling, that's a very big barrier to getting help. Medications, venlafaxine, 150 milligrams. Quetiapine, 12.5 milligrams in the morning, 25 milligrams at night. Recommended to be a short-term dosage equivalent, which is funny because here we are 3 years later and I now take upwards of 100 milligrams of quetiapine. So unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition, which is a shame. No changes in medication, provided with a 7-day supply. Elliot is a fit young man. I told you I was fit back then, of stated age, 28. He has short blonde hair, which is thinning centrally. Did they have to add that in? Anyway, short blonde hair, thinning centrally, which I might add is still thinning, but hasn't gotten much worse, all right? I've still got a bit. I'm holding on. He was casually dressed. Intense engagement at times. Good eye contact and rapport established. Speaking quickly at times, but not pressured. Normal tone and volume. That in itself is interesting because one of the key symptoms of ADHD is pressured speech. So at this point, it didn't quite click that maybe I did have pressured speech, but I was speaking quickly and we were getting near that zone, which makes sense because I have ADHD. Elliot was reactive and congruent with his affect meaning emotions in this case. Mood lability, up and down all day. One moment he feels on top of the world and then a sudden depressing drop. And again, that is a key part of borderline personality disorder. No evidence of thought disorder. So thought disorder is where you don't think coherently. That is a big part of schizophrenia, but I didn't show any signs of that. Ruminating on girlfriends, past relationship experiences. Oh, how embarrassing. Finds it very difficult to get his mind away from this. Feels distrusting towards her, even though there was no reason to be. However, intellectually knows there is no reason to feel this way, and that is so important too. So essentially what I would do, or what I have done and what I still do today, is that I challenge my illogical beliefs and thought processes. This is very much a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy type of intervention, cognitive restructuring. But the problem with CBT is, for those really complex cases, of which I am one of those, unfortunately it isn't enough. I knew that these thoughts that I was having were flat out not true. There was no logic to them at all, and it was a bit ridiculous. But unfortunately, that for me is not enough to push back against the waves of negative emotion. And that is unfortunately where CBT does fall down sometimes when it comes to this sort of stuff, these really complex cases, because these mental illnesses, especially if there's a lot of them, are so ingrained. Unfortunately, there's a lot of moving parts. But anyway, we continue. No hallucinations. He was orientated and appropriate. Cognition not formally assessed, but I'm sure if they did assess it, I'd be off the scale. Elliot had or has good insight and is psychologically minded, which makes sense because I'm a third-year psych student at this point. He has good judgment and is keen to engage with supports and ongoing treatment. There is no perceived risk issues towards the self or others at this time. However, this is changeable with his emotional dysregulation. He has just finished a brief admission for containment of risk and no issues on the ward have been reported. So basically, the idea is put someone like me in that sort of state in the psychiatric ward because our ability to, grab tangible objects in our environment to do harm towards ourselves is minimised, and obviously the nurses and the doctors are looking over you and can intervene if needed. So no issues on the ward because I'm such a pleasant person to be around. Okay, impression. Elliot is highly anxious and perfectionistic. Young man with some cluster B and C personality traits. Increased distress in the context of relationship changes because it was changing because we were on the brink of breaking up and I knew that was coming. Now, I'm going to just divert quickly and explain what cluster B and C is all about. So cluster B and C personality traits. So there's 3 clusters, cluster A, B, and C, as you probably would have guessed. So cluster A includes paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Now, don't worry if you don't know what that means. In future episodes, I will go through all these diagnoses one by one, and we'll go through it in a lot of detail, which will be great, and hopefully you'll learn a lot. Cluster B, remember I showed signs of cluster B, and you'll see why shortly, include 4 personality disorders. They are antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and, of key importance to me, borderline personality disorder. And then we have cluster C, which is interesting because I haven't been given a formal diagnosis of any of the cluster C personality disorders, which I'll mention in a minute. But at the same time, I can see why there was a bit of thought around the potentiality that I might be a part of this as well. And the 3 cluster C personality disorders are avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is not the same as OCD. And again, I'll do an episode that highlights the differences between obsessive compulsive disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Anyway, of those 3, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive, I actually tend to fit the bill for 2. Now, as I said, I'm not diagnosed with either of these 2, and the 2 I'm talking about is avoidant personality and dependent, but I do show traits of both. And just quickly, I'm going to tell you what some of the traits of these 2 are, because I'd say a lot of you probably haven't heard of these disorders before, very rarely diagnosed, very small portion of the population has this diagnosis. Avoidant personality disorder is all about being overly sensitive to criticism and rejection, regularly feeling inferior or inadequate, avoiding social activities or jobs that require working around other people, and holding back from personal relationships. And really, we can look at avoidant personality disorder as being the extreme of social anxiety disorder. So I would say avoidant is the worst case scenario of social anxiety. If we were to look at it on a continuum, the social anxiety is at one end and avoidant personality is right at the other. And dependent personality disorder, some indications of that include lacking the confidence to take care of yourself or make small decisions. See, very ADHD-like. I can see why this psychiatrist come to these conclusions. Feeling the need to be taken care of, having frequent fears of being alone. Again, fearing being alone and feeling alone is a huge part of borderline personality disorder. So again, there's that overlap. Being submissive to others. That's all about pleasing others. Big problem of mine. Having trouble disagreeing with others, not liking conflict. Again, a big part of my personality. Tolerating unhealthy relationships or abusive treatment, and feeling overly upset when relationships end or desperate to start a new relationship right away. The first part of that's definitely true, the overly upset part. Oh my God, my whole world is crashing. Not anymore, of course, because I'm a well-adjusted humanoid, but back then definitely. But the whole desperate to start a new relationship right away, that's not really me. So that's partly why I never got these diagnoses, because I don't quite fit the bill for all of them, but definitely I have traits of those 2. Okay, let's move on. So the plan moving forward, follow-up plan with the acute care team. So the acute care team, so what they did, they rang me every day for a week or 2 after this incident just to make sure I was going okay. The next plan is psychology appointment, continue current medications, recommending a medication review, and ceasing quetiapine with decreased distress, which unfortunately has not happened. Return to university starting Monday, and to increase mindfulness practice. So there you go. That is the 3rd edition of the Discharge Papers. That was a big one because that was such a momentous occasion. That particular occurrence being on the psychiatric ward, being admitted, and also this particular meeting where I got the borderline personality disorder diagnosis. that really set me up to change course and get to the point where we are today where, if you listen to the show, things aren't perfect, but we've definitely got a good hold on things compared to how we used to be. And I've got to say, I've cringed a lot throughout this because I read some of the stuff to do with my ex-girlfriend and the stuff that I obsessed over and ruminated over. Like, come on, seriously? Why did we put so much weight onto those thoughts? They are ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It's juvenile, it's high school type of behavior. But unfortunately, that is the go with mental illnesses. There doesn't have to be any reason or rhyme as to why they are influencing things in the way that they are. That is why they're an illness, because as ridiculous sometimes as these cognitions, thoughts and feelings are, that's the problem. We can't just block it out. And like I said, CBT doesn't always do the job either. And for a complex case like mine, unfortunately, it doesn't. And looking back there, it's very obvious because like I said, in that document, it says Elliot understands basically how ridiculous some of these thoughts are. He can intellectually figure out that these cognitions are not sound. But unfortunately for people like me, all the evidence in the world just is not enough to diminish the strength that some of these cognitions have over us. But thanks to a lot of psychotherapy that I've done since this point, I've done heaps over the years since, including group therapy in a dialectical behavior therapy class, which is the gold standard intervention, psychological intervention for borderline personality disorder. Lots of one-on-one work with a clinical psychologists being more than one, and also lots of consultations with a private psychiatrist as well. Those thoughts do not have the power over me like they used to. Don't get me wrong, sometimes we still fall into that trap, that's for sure, but we are a lot better at catching ourselves before they take hold, which is great news. And the reasons for why that is the case very much has to do with this consultation here, because when I heard all about borderline personality disorder and what it was about and how relevant it was to my worldview, all of a sudden something clicked and I was like, hang on, it's starting to make sense now. It didn't all make sense because, as I've said before already, that a lot of diagnoses were still yet to come, but a real big feature of that time period was the influence of the BPD aspects over my life, and it was so empowering to finally understand that what I was going through was sort of like a tangible, you could say, a tangible thing, Now there were parameters around my behaviors and there was a framework for recovery, because that's what these labels and diagnoses and acronyms and all that sort of stuff, that's what their real purpose is. It isn't to define who you are or say you fall into this box, so that means you're exactly like this, because that's just not true. The real utility of these diagnoses is because by having one of these labels, you can then create a framework for recovery. And that's really what it's all about. And just on that last point, it's very true that these labels do not define who you are or how you behave, etc. So like I said, I did group therapy, dialectical behavior therapy for BPD. I was with another 6 other people with the same diagnoses as mine, and all of us were so different from each other. So one person who's got BPD or ADHD or depression compared to someone else, it is still so individual. So please don't get too hooked up on these labels, because their function is to create a framework for recovery. That is all. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that offers some insights. That was a difficult one to produce because, well, like I said, I cringe at a lot of the stuff that was written there. It's a bit embarrassing, and there is a lot of guilt associated with this part of my story as well, because that particular girlfriend that I'm talking about wanted nothing but the best for me, but my borderline personality ensured that I would ruin what we had and ruin it. Unfortunately, we did. And I certainly don't resolve myself of responsibility, because it was really my responsibility to investigate earlier in my journey what was really going on, because at this point I'd only just really discovered that my actions actually impacted other people. And that's going to be a whole nother episode as well, because that was a huge realization for me. But up until this point, I sort of thought, my actions didn't really have consequences as far as other people's well-beings are concerned. But this particular breakup certainly dispelled that myth for me, that's for sure. And there is still a lot of guilt, shame, I suppose, remorse even associated. But anyway, that is life, unfortunately. And the good news is after that all fell apart, I did make that commitment to myself and the people that I come into contact with and converse with and have interpersonal relationships with. I took on that responsibility and said, no, we are not going to be doing this anymore because it's ruining ourselves. It's putting undue stress and pressure on other people. We need to take on that responsibility and get help now. If not for me, for everyone else that I care about, that maybe some of these behavioral manifestations are actually negatively impacting. But as you can imagine, there's a whole lot more to that story, and you're going to have to stick around a bit longer before I really go into the nitty-gritty of that particular relationship breakdown. But needless to say, without that relationship breakdown, all these advances I've had with my mental health and even with life and just being a better person and more switched on and more successful, a lot of it I do owe to, unfortunately, the ending of that relationship, because that really took the wool from over my eyes and we couldn't deny, repress anymore. Anyway, thank you for listening. As I said, that was a very hard one to get through, a little bit embarrassing, but as you know, there are no secrets on this show. No way at all. This is, I've said it before, I'll say it again, this has got to be the most real, fair income, genuine podcast on all of the internet. So I'd really appreciate it if you know anyone who may get something out of listening to me ramble on about my mental health. Please show them this podcast, because every stream of the show that I get releases a bit of dopamine in my brain and I feel good. So you should feel good about that too. Anyway, that's enough rambling for me. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. And I will see you next time on the next episode of the Dysregulated podcast.